Well, that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is that you're not a Bitcoin fanboy. And that really comes through. This is a historical and a bit of a technical analysis. One thing you spend a lot of time on, and this is very near and dear to most libertarians, is the idea of a true peer-to-peer decentralized currency where it's almost like we're paying each other cash in a parking lot somewhere. There's no intermediary, and that's of course one of the great selling points of Bitcoin. Talk more about that. Talk about how important that is, and how with government money, with credit cards, with checks, with all other forms of payment, you don't have that luxury.
Yeah, so I mean, the distinctive thing about Bitcoin, Bitcoin. I like the term. It's been misevangelized. People have made a mistake of evangelizing Bitcoin as being, cheap, free, instant payments all over the world. And that's not exactly the case. It's not entirely the case. Bitcoin is not a payment technology. Bitcoin is a money. It's a hard money. And that's really fundamentally the point. Bitcoin is a hard money, like gold, but with its built-in settlement network. So imagine if we just discovered this new chemical element on Earth, which is exactly like gold, but, fixed in its supply, and also comes with this, magical global network that allows you to have about 500,000 transactions with it anywhere around the world, where you can click a button and in 1 hour it turns up in China. That's really the difference between it. So so far, given that Bitcoin is not very popular yet, it hasn't grown, we're still at a point where everybody who uses Bitcoin is able to use the transactions on Bitcoin. And the transaction fees are relatively low now. They're less than 10 cents or something like that. But, we saw during the end of last year, the transaction fees rose significantly. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think in the long run, we're going to see transaction fees rise more and more and more. They're going to be the only thing that secures the network. And I think there's a hard limit on how many transactions can take place on the Bitcoin network per day, because, the way that it functions, the way that Bitcoin is engineered, is that there's a limit, is that every member needs to have a list of every transaction carried out by every other member. And so that is a heavy computation load on any computer. Before I can send you $10 for my lunch at your restaurant, you need to know every single dime spent by anybody anywhere in the world to make sure that my $10 are still there. Right. And that's really one of the main reasons I wrote the book. I'm trying to explain that Bitcoin is not going to be the replacement for Visa or for MasterCard or for PayPal. I think these payment mechanisms will be, or can be, built on top of Bitcoin, or things similar to them will be built on top of Bitcoin. And my expectation is that we're going to get things that are far more efficient. But in my opinion, the element of, peer-to-peer, individual to individual is very important in Bitcoin. But I don't think, and this is where, I get another way in which I differ with a lot of Bitcoiners, is that, this dream that every single person would be able to carry out a final settlement transaction with everyone else for every coffee that they buy, I don't think that's workable in the long run. Bitcoin won't scale that way. However, the advantage is not going to be that it's going to give us cheap coffee payments and cheap lunch payments. The advantage is that it's going to allow us to have a far wider, far bigger, far more decentralized network of institutions able to perform final settlements with one another. So if you look at the world today, we have a couple of hundred central banks in the world, but effectively, really, we only have one central bank. And the only way that payments function quickly in the world today is that they are effectively all going through the SWIFT network, which is through the Federal Reserve. So, if I pay you with PayPal, with a Visa, with MasterCard, with a bank transfer, effectively, the central bank of the US could stop us from making this payment, no matter where we are in the world. You could be in China and I could be in Kenya, and the US central bank could stop that payment. It's all centralized because the nature of the settlement with gold, which I believe is still the monetary standard, and that's why central banks still hold enormous quantities of gold. And as I mentioned in the book, central banks today hold far more gold than they did under the gold standard. And that tells you that gold's role has not been removed. But the point is that settlement with gold is very expensive. And so that tends towards the centralization of it, and that tends towards the centralization of political power. I think what Bitcoin allows us is distribution and the decentralization of the final settlement layer, so that instead of having one central bank, we'd have something like maybe 10,000, maybe more institutions that function like central banks, none of which can affect the money supply because none of them can alter the Bitcoin code, but all of whom can perform final settlement of payments. And I think this is what really excites me about Bitcoin. It is just turning central banking from this institution that allows the state unlimited power and unlimited control over its citizens to this utility that's going to be just, like the local, maybe post office is a bad example because post offices are usually government monopolies, but just like a basic utility that is available all over the world that people can opt in and out of, people can choose their local bank. And I think that's the really exciting thing. And we're seeing this develop now. And that's the reason behind the title of my book, that we're seeing the way that Bitcoin is scaling. We're already seeing that it's scaling through layered settlement solutions. So more and more of Bitcoin's transactions are not being carried out on chain. They're being carried out on second layers. So it used to be a couple of years ago, for instance, if you had an account at an exchange and I had an account at an exchange and I wanted to send you Bitcoin from my account to your account, the exchanges didn't care. They would actually transmit that transaction onto the Bitcoin blockchain and they'd pay the transaction fee for it. Then as the Bitcoin transaction fees rose, which is expected to happen at some point inevitably, exchanges became much more careful about it. And so they would settle the transaction between you and me on their ledger. And then they would only settle transactions on Bitcoin's ledger when you and I will take money out or send money into the network. So we're seeing that for every transaction on Bitcoin, there are maybe 2, 3, 5, maybe even 10 transactions happening off chain. Quite similar to how settlement with the gold standard happened, in that, for every one time that a gold ounce or a gold bar moves between one bank and the other, you have hundreds of transactions of the pieces of paper and the checking accounts that are backed by that gold move.
Right. But I want to get back to this point you made. This is not how Bitcoin was sold, right? It was sold as every time you spend $4 at Tim Hortons, you're going to use your Bitcoin, and Tim Hortons is going to accept it, and all that's going to have to show up on the ledger. So I think it's an important point you're making, that this is a way to have a non-governmental settlement process, and I think that has a tremendous value in itself.